Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. We are here again, week 2 of Canadian Whiskey certification. A special hello to our 100 students that are watching with us right now. Whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, we appreciate you being here. Today, we're joined again by Gina and Dave, and we're also joined by a special guest, Ricky. Dave's going to talk a little bit about what Ricky's doing here in just a second, but just a quick reminder to give us a like on this Facebook if you're watching it, on Portland Cocktail Week, Camp Run Amok, or over on YouTube. Subscribe there to keep in touch with us with the Canadian Whiskey certification. Like I said, we're on week 2, so we still have 2 more weeks after this one of a lot of education for you. I'm going to throw it over to Dave and Gina to talk a little bit about what we're doing this week.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. Welcome back.
Hi.
Happy to see everyone's here. We didn't scare anyone off last week. That's fantastic. This week, we're going into Canadian whiskey production from grain to glass. Gina and I are very excited to show off Hiram Walker & Sons Distillery, where all of our whiskeys are produced. We've been open since 1857, down in the most southern tip of Canada, right across from Detroit. We're actually so far down in Canada that if we need to go to the US, we have to drive north. Think about that for a minute. This week's going to have a lot of video footage, so we're taking you in behind the scenes that even when we do in-depth tours, you're going to see a lot of things that most people don't. So this is going to be pretty exciting. And I need to give a shout out to our guy, Ricky, who you're viewing again. If you don't remember, Ricky is here to help us translate anything into Spanish. So please send any questions, concerns, anything you need. Ricky will get this translated and we'll get it back to you. So we really appreciate you helping us with this, Ricky. And on that note, I think we're ready to get rocking and rolling. Gina, are you ready?
I am ready. Let's do this. Okay, everyone. Welcome to week 2, like Dave said. Today we're going to go through whiskey production. Obviously, we're talking about Canadian whiskey, so specifically, we're going to talk about Canadian whiskey production. Now, in doing so, we are very lucky to work for this fantastic portfolio of whiskeys that you're tasting through in this 4 weeks. But they are all produced at the Hiram Walker Distillery, which you can see in this black and white photo here. Now, this distillery in particular is massive. You can really only see parts of it here, a good bulk of it, but it is massive. We can't possibly get it all in one photo, but this gives you a little bit view of the scope of this distillery. And what we're going to do is use the Hiram Walker Distillery as an example to show you different styles being produced throughout Canada. Because it's so large, it really has the ability to do a lot of different things. And it does. In production, you know, Hiram Walker and the people working there use a lot of different styles, techniques to produce different whiskeys that, you know, those distillation styles and techniques are used throughout Canada. So we are very lucky to have that scope to work with. Like I said, it's one of the largest distilleries in North America. So kind of wrap your head around that. To show you scope of this distillery in particular, we do have a video to show you. So here we go. All right, so there were a lot of stats that came up across the screen there. And for any of our certification students that are going to get a quiz at the end of this week, you don't have to memorize all of those stats. But we really are trying to show you, when we look inside these different styles of production and the processes, really, just to familiarize yourself with the distillery itself a little bit. So what we're going to go through today in production is grain intake from the farmers to the distillery into milling that grain to make a grist. Of course, we take that grist to the cookers, cook them down into a mash. We bring that mash to fermentation through distillation. Now we're going to stop there today. And next week we will cover maturation specifically. And then in week 4, we're going to get into blended whiskey and rye whiskey. Now, specific to those stats you just saw, sometimes it helps to just see them up on your screen. When we talk about our grains at Hiram Walker, there's 19 grain silos. We're taking in about 100,000 metric ton of corn every year, and about 10,000 metric ton of rye every year, using a hammer mill specifically to mill down that grain into a grist, and then going into the cook, making that mash. There are 39 fermentation tanks at Hiram Walker. They each stand 4 stories high. You'll get to see those a little later, but massive fermentation room, you can imagine. After fermentation, we have a beer. Taking that beer to distillation. At Hiram Walker, we're producing whiskeys in 3 different styles of distillation. So we'll either do a single column distillation, much like you would see most of your big house American whiskeys made or produced, bourbons, ryes, etc. A double column distillation. We'll get into what that does to the whiskey and what style that produces. And then we also do a column distillation, that single column distillation, and then take that batch into a very slow pot distillation. We're distilling around 180,000 liters a day of alcohol. So again, just to show you scope here. And then just touching on maturation a little here, we are housing about 1.6, minimum 1.6, sometimes a little more, million barrels at any given time in our warehouses. And then we'll take that whiskey to blend into new bottling or not, serve it as a single distillate. Okay, so let's talk about our ingredients. Let's go to the beginning of this process. Our grains. We learned last week whiskey is made from grain, right? So we've got corn, wheat, rye, barley, whatever grain you want to make whiskey from. The big takeaway here for Canadian whiskey production specifically is that these grains are produced separately. They're milled, cooked, fermented, distilled, and aged at 100% corn, 100% rye, 100% wheat, what have you. And then at the end of the day, you have these whiskeys that are 100% corn whiskey in the warehouse, 100% wheat. Now, we then have different styles of corn, wheat, rye, barley whiskeys because we can ferment it at different temperatures, add nitrogen at different times or different levels. We can distill it in different ways to, really accentuate or take out certain flavor compounds, age it in different types of wood. So now this gives us a lot of variables at the end of the day and a lot of different whiskeys aging in the warehouses. This style of production is not regulated in Canada, that they produce every grain separately. It really just has become the tradition. There certainly are distilleries making mash bills, but you're going to see most of your big distilleries really creating blends in this way at 100% grain bill whiskeys. So what do these grains impart in our whiskey? First up, we have corn. This is going to give us sweet, creamy notes in our whiskey. Wheat is going to give us toasty, bready notes. We're going to have rye that'll give us those big, bold, spicy flavors. And then barley will give us a little bit of a foundation or a nuttiness in our whiskeys. At Hiram Walker, these grains are all sourced as locally as possible. So for the most part, we are sourcing everything from local Ontario farmers. We do have one family of farmers that have been with us generationally since the distillery opened in 1858. So we have very long history with the farmers in the area. But that's not to say that if there is a bad year of crops, that, because the weather was bad or, some sort of disease spread across the area, across the crops in the agricultural community, we are not going to give up the quality of grain. We have very high quality standards, and that is not something that we bend on. So when that happens, I think it was about 5 years ago, there was a lot of rain. It was a very, very wet summer. And the rye coming in was just not meeting the standards that we needed to have. So we sourced our rye actually in Michigan, which proximity wise is local, but it is another country. But it's right across the river, Michigan. And we'll go as far as Illinois sometimes if we really need to. But first, we're going to source locally and use the grains in our area. So let's take a look at this process. A truck comes in with a bed full of grain. This is corn here. And you'll see this probe that goes all the way to the bottom of the truck bed. What this probe is doing is taking samples of grain from different layers. This allows us to sample the grain and ensure that nobody may have hidden a faulty layer of grain or something that wouldn't meet our quality standards somewhere toward the bottom or in the middle. That sample is going to come into Alice right there. She's who we would call our gatekeeper. She does a lot of different tests on this grain as quickly as possible because that person who drove the truck bed in is waiting on her. But she's going to test the grain for kernel size, making sure that's consistent, you can see right here how it is going to mill into a grist. She'll check moisture levels. She'll check for contamination. She uses her nose to smell for a very specific compound called geosmin, which if she can smell that, it's very musty, cardboardy smell. She can reject the entire truckload based on her nose alone. She's very highly trained on this. And she stands behind bulletproof glass because you can imagine if you reject an entire load of grain, that is someone's livelihood, it can get to be a very heated conversation. So she is really our gatekeeper, and she ensures that the quality of grain really meets the standards that we need for our high quality whiskey. So those ingredients are going to now go into a pre-mix tank for the cook. Okay. So first, we just talked about our grains. At Hiram Walker, we are making whiskey out of corn, wheat, rye, barley. We're also doing malted rye whiskeys, and we have some malted barley whiskeys as well. That grain is going to a hammer mill. So once we're ready for whiskey production with that grain, it's going to go through a hammer mill. And you can see that right here. It's going to go through the top and come out, just like Dave is showing us right there, as this really coarse flour to go into the cook. Next up are enzymes. We will add enzymes. Now remember, we're doing things at 100% grain builds in Canada. So unless you're doing like malted barley whiskey or malted grain that has enzymes within the grain itself, you're going to need them to help that fermentation process along. What enzymes do, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but starch, so our grain is made up of starch, and starch is really a very large unit. It's too large. It's made up of over 10,000 dextrose units. It's much too large for the yeast to digest once the yeast gets added and needs to feed on sugars or the starch, which breaks down into sugars. So what the enzymes do is break those starch chains down into smaller digestible units for the yeast, which allows it to multiply, allows it to produce alcohol at the end of the day more efficiently. We will use exogenous enzymes when we need to, which is a lot of the time because most of our whiskeys are not malted grain. The bulk of our whiskeys are, 100% corn, wheat, rye, and barley. So those exogenous enzymes, they're not synthetic. They're cultivated in a lab, much like yeast is. They're just not coming from within the grain itself. Next, we're adding some water. The water source for Hiram Walker is the Great Lakes watershed. And I'll see if you can see my pointer here, but the distillery is sitting at the southernmost tip of Canada, just above Lake Erie on the western side, across the river from Detroit, like I said. So the Great Lakes watershed is really important to our operation because that's where we're pulling the water. Next up, we're going to add backstillage, or some people might call this sour mash. Most distilleries in North America for American whiskey styles are going to add this backstillage or sour mash. Now, it's very popular for Tennessee whiskey as a category to name this or state this on their labels, sour mash. But most bourbons do it as well. Most ryes do it as well. And Canadian whiskey is no exception. What this is doing, there is a reason for this. Backstillage it's the leftover spent grain. It's kind of like a sludge or porridge consistency. It's left over at the bottom of the still after the distillation. So you've taken out the alcohol and some flavor compounds that are going into the whiskey, evaporated them off. What is left? Well, there's this backstillage or sour mash. And there's a couple purposes for it that it will be reused, but one of them is to go into the beginning of the next batch. And what that does is lower the pH level, so really balancing that out to prevent contamination and really, balance the pH where we need it to be. But also keep the consistency in flavor right from the beginning, from batch to batch. So this really helps keep the products consistent. And finally, we're going to add some nitrogen. Now, this is something not a lot of distilleries talk about, but a lot use at different parts of the process. Hiram Walker will use nitrogen here in the cook, but as well as in fermentation. And really, think about it like adding nitrogen to your lawn. It helps your grass grow. So this is the same concept. You're adding nitrogen, and it's really going to help the yeast grow at a faster rate, be more efficient. And Hiram Walker has really been able to get their beers, their distilling beers from fermentation for corn up to consistently up to 15-16% ABV because of the way and the timing and the amounts that they're adding nitrogen here. So really making it, a higher yielding product and a more efficient process. Okay, so we have all of those things. They go into the cook and we have a mash. So just looking at a little video footage here, there's our pipes for different water coming in, all of those ingredients going into the pre-mixed tank. Once they're mixed together and really combined, then they're going to go through all of this piping system over to our cookers. Now, these are our batch cookers. So they're going to go into the cook. And right now you're looking at the tops of these cookers, but in a moment you'll see them from the bottom as well. There we go. So this is where that cooking process is going to take place in these large cookers before they go to fermentation. Okay, so let's look at cooking and fermentation. What is happening? I talked about starch. I touched on that. So let's look at that a little bit deeper. On the left-hand side, you can see under a microscope starch. So at 67 degrees Celsius, you can see these little like round starch pieces. As it heats up, it's going to swell, expand, continues to swell and expand until it finally bursts or pops open, much like popcorn, if you think of it in that way. Now, when it pops open, now these large starch strains that I talked about are exposed. This is where the enzymes can start to do their job, and they just jump right in and start cutting these very large starch strains apart down into sugar. Then, once our cook is done, once we've cooled our mash, we're going to go to fermentation. Now, I talked about in all of those stats, right? We've got 39 fermentation tanks at Hiram Walker. They each stand 4 stories high. It is impossible to get them all in one shot. This is actually the bottom of the tanks. What you were looking at before was the tops of them. But this is 4 stories down here. And this is where we're going to pour that mash and then add the yeast, which he is about to do right now. So a powdered yeast is going to go in. Now, what happens when you add yeast? The yeast are starting to gobble up all of those sugar molecules. So they're taking those in as food. They're excreting, most people know, alcohol, carbon dioxide, heat. This does heat up. But it's also letting out new flavor compounds. Fruity notes, floral, green grassy notes, soapy, sulfur notes. And you can see it kind of bubbling there. Now that's Amy, she's our distiller, and our certification students will be meeting her tomorrow in our private workshop. But you see how bubbly that is? That's because the yeast is producing all this carbon dioxide and all these gases coming out, right? And so it's bubbling. You can see it bubbling in fermentation. And now she's pouring out a sample of beer right there. So that's what our distiller's beer is going to look like toward the end there. So fermentation is where we add the yeast and make a beer. All right, so distillation. I talked about 3 different styles that we do at Hiram Walker. So we luckily can show you those 3 styles. Of course, there's more throughout Canada and many countries, but these are the 3 main styles producing Canadian whiskey. First up is that single column distillation that I talked about. So this is our beer still. This is our single column still. It's 100% copper. It does look like it's stainless steel on the outside there. That's just insulation. It stands 5 stories high. This photo here in the middle. It's just a portion of the still because it stands so high. And of course, there's flooring in between each level. So we can't get a picture of the entire thing. But just to give you an idea of how this thing works, the beer goes in at the top, toward the top, and the steam comes up through the bottom. Now at each one of those round doors is a plate, a copper plate, and it's got a bunch of little holes in it. So that beer's going in the top and it's flowing down through from plate to plate through the still. The steam is pushing up through the plates, through those holes. And at each level, you're seeing distillation, a separate little distillation happening on each plate at a different temperature. So it's gonna distill different flavor compounds, different types of alcohol, etc. Now, we were lucky enough that when Dave and the crew filmed all of this video footage, they were cleaning the still, which isn't all the time. So we were very lucky to be able to take a peek inside. And here you can see that is one of the plates with all those little holes in it right there. Amy just opened up that door for us to see. So you can see the inside of the still. It's very rare that you get to see the inside of one of these stills because they're always operating, right? So like I said, this still is 100% copper. Copper is incredibly important to distillation. Now, you don't have to have 100% copper still. I've seen many stills that are stainless steel, and they'll add copper somewhere in the process. Might be at the top with a bunch of copper wiring. It might be copper plates. There might be copper pieces throughout the still. Ours is 100% copper. And what that does is it's taking the sulfur notes that I talked about that yeast produces, and it's adsorbing that, and it's turning it in or salting it into copper sulfate, which is why this still needs cleaned every once in a while to get that copper sulfate removed. You can see these plates, separate pictures of them. Some of them are different plates from different, I think the bottom one is from Vendome actually when I visited, but plates outside of a still, what they look like. But copper is very important to distillation. You've got to have it at some point in the process. Otherwise, you're going to taste sulfur. Nobody wants to smell or taste sulfur in their whiskey. So what we end up with here after a single column distillation would be a full-bodied whiskey. We're going to retain the grain character. So if it's a corn whiskey, we're going to retain that sweet, creamy notes. If it's rye, we're going to retain those big, bold, spicy notes. We're going to retain most of the yeast character. Copper is going to take out the sulfur, but we're going to keep those fruity, floral, the green, grassy notes, and even the soapy notes are going to remain in the whiskey. And here at Hiram Walker, we're bringing this up to about a 70% ABV off of this still. Now, our next style of distillation is double column distillation. So first it goes through that beer still that we just talked about, and then we're going to take it through a second column. What this does, now we've got this full-bodied whiskey, right, that we just talked about, but now going through a second column distillation, here's where we start to strip out things. We're stripping out a lot of the grain character. We're stripping out a lot of the yeast character. Not 100% of it, but it really does become a very light style whiskey. And it's great to use not only in blending as kind of a glue to help bigger, bolder flavors meld together, but also it's really nice on its own to show off maturation specifically. And here we have Dr. Don, who you'll see in a second, pulling off a sample off that second column distillation. Now, all whiskey is going to come out clear off of the still, but he's pulling a sample specifically off that second column. So what we end up with here, I should say, is a lighter base style whiskey. At Hiram Walker, we'll use that as a base for our blends, but we also use it on our own. You'll get to taste some of that today. We're going to strip out most of the grain character. We're going to strip out most of the yeast character. And we're coming up very high here, 94 to 95% ABV. It's really hard to go much higher without additives. And finally, our next style of distillation would be that beer still again into a pot still. Now this one is actually a combo still we use for experimental purposes. Here's the pot still we use most. We make lot 40 with it. Of course, that label is right on the outside of that still, but we also make other pot distilled whiskeys in this still. It is 100% copper, just like our other stills, but we do insulate it on the outside to keep everything at the temperatures that we want them to be at. Now, these stills here are old gin stills, but Dr. Don is going to open this one up and show us the inside. So when we look at pot distillation, we see all these coils at the bottom. This is really acting like a pot of soup on the stove, okay? And as the soup heats up, so those coils on the bottom are your stove, as the soup is heating up, or as our whiskey is heating up, is starting to distill, think about that soup in your kitchen. the longer it's heating, the hotter it gets, the more aromas that come off of that soup, right? The more things you smell at different temperatures. Same thing goes for pot distillation. So at different temperatures, you're going to get, some green grassy notes coming off the very top. Those are our heads. Then you're going to get mostly your fruity notes coming in. And then you're going to have your floral, and this says spice, but whatever grain, this was built for a lot 40 dive, but whatever grain. So if it's corn, it would be, your sweet, creamy notes, but your grain notes, your floral and grain notes, and then your soapy notes on the tails of this. And this allows the distiller to decide where to make the cut points for that specific whiskey, or not at all. You don't have to make cut points. But if you want to concentrate up certain flavors or flavor notes, you can, make sure you're capturing at specific temperatures, capturing those vapors and that condensation. And then you're really capturing those specific flavor notes. So this pot still, really allows us to concentrate up very specific flavors in the whiskey by making cut points. And here, from the beer still at 70%, it'll then go into the pot still and come out around 80% ABV. And finally, back to our Canada versus the United States that we like to compare to because of all of our misconceptions. In Canada, we really look at recipe creation happening after maturation. So we're blending the grain profiles after maturation because we're putting in a corn whiskey, a rye whiskey, or whatever whiskeys we're blending together. We're really doing that recipe creation after. In the US, we're really doing that recipe creation before production or at the beginning of production, during the cook, when you're making a mash bill. And again, in the US, that is not regulated that you make a mash bill. Now, depending what type of whiskey you want to come out with in the end and whether you can blend or not, might make those decisions for you, but it's not regulated how you make American whiskey. So typically we will see in the US those grains, those grain profiles and flavors really being blended at the beginning during the cook when they're making a mash bill. So a couple of examples you would see in Canada, you might blend a corn whiskey, a rye whiskey, a wheat whiskey for a bottling. You might just bottle up a rye whiskey. You might bottle up a very complex layered blend. A corn whiskey, 2 different styles of rye, 2 different styles of wheat, 2 different styles of barley, and just get a really layered whiskey. All of these blends actually are whiskeys that we are tasting throughout our course. And just to give you a visual on, for the most part, how things are done in the US, you'll really see, typically you'll see the same mash bill being produced and even aged the same, because a lot of the categories have brand new oak as a requirement. So you'll see same maturation for the most part, same mash bill, so the same whiskey style going into one bottling. And now this is opinion, but I've got to say it. This is kind of why I think in Canada, we really focus on our master blender. This is the person creating the grain recipe at the end of the day. And in the US, we really focus on our master distillers. Again, this is the person creating the grain recipe toward the beginning of the process. So just a different way to look at it based on really how these whiskeys are produced. Okay, I am going to turn it over to Dave to take us through 2 really fantastic whiskeys that'll show off this production style.
Thank you, Professor Fawcett. All right. So we've had a great trip through from the moment grains arrive at the distillery up to distillation. Obviously, next week we'll get into maturation. First up, we are going to try the J.P. Wiser's 18-year-old. So all of you grab that JP Weiser's 18. And I mean, this is one of my faves, but the two whiskeys we're going to try today are very different from each other. The JP Weiser's 18 is a beautiful blend of 100% corn whiskey. It's aged in used Canadian whiskey casks, which we will get into more in depthly next week, but it is an ex-bourbon cask that we purchased from the US that we'll use over and over again. So this really emphasizes grain and yeast characteristics, and such as mature oak and autumn florals, a little bit of spice. Now, if you poured yourself some whiskey right now, you're going to see it's a beautiful golden, almost like amber color. That's what it's looking like for me right now. Now, on the nose, I always get a lot of vanilla. Somebody said vanilla cedar once, so I've stolen that because I agree with it. A little vanilla cedar, those autumn florals I was talking about, a little bit of fresh pine, lots of mature oak. And I mean, this is probably the softest whiskey. You've got 10 whiskeys in your kit we've sent you. In my opinion, this is probably the softest one. So grab a sip. Take a sip. I don't know why I said grab a sip. I mean, very soft, extremely smooth. I'm getting the mature oak off this, getting a little bit of green apple, almost a little bit of Granny Smith dipped in caramel. Now we're going to get into the rest of this whiskey more in depth next week. You see Gina popped up. She's making sure I don't go into this too much about the aging process on this. So basically, this is standard traditional at 40% ABV, 80 proof, and it is a beautiful whiskey on its own. I mean, I can think of a time one of my bartenders texted me. I was away working, and they said, there's two guys at the bar drinking all of the JP Weiser's 18, and I text back. I'm like, great, what's the point? And they're like, they're mixing it with Coca-Cola. I was like, you know, they're going to do whatever they want to do. I said, I wouldn't suggest that. I mean, I'd use a less expensive whiskey, but drink it any way you want, whatever blows your hair back. But we suggest drinking this one on its own, a little bit of water, a cube of ice, depending on how you're feeling. But I hope you're all enjoying this one right now. Now, we probably should move over to the next whiskey, unless there's any big questions at all. See, I like this.
I'm gonna stop you for a second with a question. Now, without getting into too much of next week, how do the temperature fluctuations affect the ability to keep expressions consistent? My answer to that is that's where the magic of blending comes in.
Well, I was going to say that's going to be really getting into it for next week.
Yeah, and there is.
You are correct. The fluctuations, because you know, right now it's, you know, it goes to, in the summer months we get very warm. We're pretty south, so it goes up to 35, 40 Celsius. You know, that's close to 100 Fahrenheit, and it's negative 20 with the wind. We will go 35, 40 Celsius on very extreme days. It's like one or two a year, but that equals out to negative 40 Fahrenheit. That's cold, people. So, you know, everything really does freeze up in those warehouses with the exception of the whiskey. Dr. Don will always send me, text me photos. He's out gauging the temperature from them. I was going to say, I feel like we're going to get into that in depthly next week. I think that's a question for next week, don't you, Gina?
Yep. And you're breaking up a little bit. So I'm just going to jump in here a little bit.
Me.
But is the mash fully cooked or cooled, when the yeast is added? It's not cooled down to room temperature, but it certainly is cooled down. Like I said in the presentation, that it does get cooled before going into fermentation, because otherwise you would just kill off the yeast. So you do need to cool it down to a temperature that the yeast can survive, and not only survive, but thrive and multiply in it. And then one more question before we go to lot 40. Do you use the same yeast for all of the different grains and whiskeys? At Hiram Walker, right now, yes. We use the same commercial yeast. And Don loves to talk about this. So when we get to Don's section, especially in week 4, this is something that we should definitely bring up to him, but he loves talking about why. Now he does have in little vials some of Hiram Walker's yeast strains that he is able to make whiskey from, and he is kind of working on that project on the back end. But up until recently, he really feels like consumers, and still the mass consumer, when you think about, producing a mass amount of whiskey, the majority of consumers don't care what kind of yeast you're using. So yet, I think that is right around the corner. And there's certainly distilleries doing that very, very well and educating consumers on that very, very well. Four Roses is a great example of that. But right now, currently, the whiskeys that you'll be tasting do all use the same yeast strains. Okay, are we okay to go to the next whiskey, to lot 40?
Yes, apologies. As you probably noticed, I was freezing up there, so I hope you can hear me now. Am I back?
You're back.
You're good? Sorry about that. Sorry, as we would say up here in Canada. So next up, you see it's lot 40 on the screen. Here's the beautiful bottle right now. If any of our students in the US or American viewers are watching, the label's probably a little bit different, which just means during the pandemic, there was bunch of extra stock and we're just blowing through the old labels, but that's your current 100% rye whiskey right there. Now, lot 40's got a bit of a story to it. It's got a bit of a past, even though it's fairly new whiskey. Being 100% rye grain, and as we were discussing last week, traditional Canadian whiskey is what? It's usually that soft double column distilled corn with a little pinch of rye added to it. So our previous master blender at Hiram Walker in the 90s came up with the idea, what if we were to put that little bit of rye that goes into Canadian whiskey on its own in a bottle? So that's exactly what we did. We released lot 40 in the late 90s, 100% rye whiskey, and we released it across Canada and parts of the US and Europe. Now, aging myself, that's the time when I started bartending. And I traveled a lot. I wanted to see the world, and I bartended everywhere. One thing in common in the bartending and cocktail world back then is most drinks were served in glasses shaped like this. They were neon colored, fruity, juicy, very vodka based. Sex in the City ruled the airwaves. It was pop culture. What do you think happened when we released 100% rye whiskey during those times? Any thoughts? It did not do very well. To be quite honest, it failed miserably. No one was looking for 100% rye whiskey. Even south of the border in the US, people were not into that 100% rye. So naturally, it went away for a while. Now, I think you're all familiar. I lived this, but the early 2000s, I think there's some people on here that did the same thing with me. We watched bartenders in New York City and London, UK, pull out old cocktail books, started reviving classics. Boozy stirred drinks became very popular. Mad Men replaced Sex in the City for pop culture, so everyone in a suit and tie wanted a martini or Manhattan at lunch. And someone at our company came up with the idea, what if we brought back that 100% rye whiskey from a decade ago that didn't work? Well, we did, and Dr. Don was our current master blender at this time, and he wanted to take a shot at it. So he changed up the recipe a little bit to where lot 40 is very simple. We call it rye in its purest form. It is 100% rye grain, column distilled once, strip away the harsh qualities and characteristics from the grain. We then pot distill it afterwards. You saw the video, the little 8,000 liter still for 12 hours. Now this helps us do very accurate cuts. So we discard of the heads and the tails, which is basically getting rid of the green grass and soapy characteristics. Nothing wrong with those, but Dr. Don's not using them in this whiskey. So we're left with the hearts, and that's going to be all your rye notes, rye bread, baking spices, cinnamon, clove. You're going to have citrus and floral notes in that. Now, rye is a big, bold grain, so we do lay this down in New American oak, char number 2. And this really kind of tames the beast, rounds it out. It adds the vanilla, toffee, caramel aspects to all the rye and the baking spices. Makes that beautiful 100% rye whiskey. Bottled it at 43 ABV, 86 proof. Someone just said they get eucalyptus and mint on the nose. So do I. And not everyone does, but I do. So this is a great way to, whoops, wrong one. Let's move into this. Top 40. Now this is a deep, rich amber compared to what we just had. On the nose, I get the eucalyptus. I always say I get a little white pepper. Someone just said black pepper. I get that too. I mean, I certainly get the rye bread. I get a little bit of warm honey. You get that vanilla, that soft warming vanilla from the casks. Now, taking your sip. I mean, that's rye through and through. That is beautiful, rich rye, baking spices. I mean, it doesn't have a big, powerful impact like some American ryes might, where, I mean, the proof is a little bit lower. I mean, the pot distillation certainly adds an elegant side to this. I'm getting a lot of the warming vanilla off this. Getting sweet toffee caramel. I'm getting some good notes. Raisins. Somebody said cough syrup. So you can't be wrong. I like hearing that. One of their favorite ryes. Me too. And I mean, this is the reason I'm here. When this was introduced and I was not working with this company, I used this as my house whiskey at my little spots in Toronto. Fell in love with it right away. The classic cocktail movement had made its way to Toronto. A lot of old fashions, Manhattans, Vieux Carrés, you name it. But as we were talking earlier, with this little soft, elegant side to it, a lot of fun. You saw last week, Evelyn made a really tall, refreshing drink with Flop 40. And we're seeing that in a lot of places like California, Texas, warmer climates, where people aren't always asking for boozy stirred. They're doing tall, refreshing drinks. So this is a very versatile whiskey, if you ask me.
We do have a couple questions that I think are, relate to Lot 40 specifically. One is that on average, is there a variance in types or species of any individual grain used?
Oh, that is a great question. And I think you already know the answer to this, Gina, that Dr. Don's probably going to speak to that a little bit. Well, he'll probably speak to that a lot. Currently, what we're drinking now, I think it's safe to say no, but I think there's some experiments laying down, and I think the topic of types of grains is going to become, I think Don believes it's going to be something we're going to be seeing a lot more in the future.
Yeah, and honestly, and he and Amy probably can both talk about this a little bit more in depth. Not probably, they can. But specific to Lot 40, they actually went into a contract with a company in Germany, securing Brasetto rye specifically, and experimenting with that. They now have the farmers in Ontario farming it, and they have distilled it. It's in the warehouses. I don't know, Dave, do you, if that's starting to be in the bottlings yet, or if it's still aging? I know as it's aging, it has been aging a little spicier than the previous rye.
My answer is not going to be 100%. I'm guessing a little bit, so I'd rather not answer, and let's wait to talk to Dawn.
Yeah, let's ask them. Let's ask Amy or Dawn in the workshop sessions.
I don't want to lie to anyone.
I don't either. Yeah, but I know it's aging for sure. I don't know if we're starting to see that come into Lot 40, specifically into the bottlings.
Now, just to kind of wrap up, and I mean, I know there's a couple questions, but I'll just wrap up my little tale. So this Lot 40 that Dawn put out, we're talking back in the 90s where the one failed. We were really happy to see, I mean, how palates had evolved. This Lot 40 was released in 2012, and that year took home the award of Best Canadian Whiskey, which is pretty amazing. That was, really great. It took that award several times at many different whiskey awards from the UK to the US, Canada. It's done very well, and it's a cult favorite where in my travels, wherever our whiskeys are sold, whether it's over in the UK or Germany or France, US, when I'm popping into well-known cocktail bars, I always kind of look now when 50 Best come out to see if we're on their menus, and a lot of time we are. So this has become a bartender favorite, along with whiskey geeks and aficionados. But I think you'd agree, Gina, this is the bartender whiskey out of a lot of ours that gets used in a lot of drinks.
This is the favored one for sure. One question I'll take is, does the pot still, after the column still, function like the doubler or a thumper would in American whiskey distillation? That is a really great question. So when you think about American distillation, for a few different reasons, a lot of distilleries will use a doubler or a thumper, they'll call it. And what that really is kind of another quick distillation. It takes it out of a single column still. It'll run it through a thumper, and a large batch could be run in about 30 minutes. So very quickly. And a lot of that really is to increase copper contact if there's not 100% copper still, or up the ABV a little bit, or both. Those are the main reasons you would use a doubler or thumper. The pot still, like Dave talked about here for Lot 40, it's not a huge pot still. We're doing 8,000 liter batches, but it's a 12-hour distillation. And that's something I didn't touch on earlier, and I should have. But, if you think about single malt scotches, for instance, now every distillery is very different in how they produce, but generally speaking, you're going to see a pot distillation happen between 4 to 7 hours. Typically you'll see it somewhere in that range. This is a 12-hour distillation. Another reason for that insulation around the still, to hold those temperatures for longer amounts of time, so that the distillation is happening slower, and it's allowing for our distiller to make more accurate cut points on the liquid and really capture, because it doesn't just like the ethyl acetate just doesn't stop coming off the still suddenly. It slowly stops coming off at different temperatures, so it'll meld one into the other. So the slower you can do that distillation and hold those temperatures, the more accurate you can make those cut points. So it really isn't like going through a doubler or a thumper.
Excellent response, Professor.
Well, we're almost to the end of our hour. Do you want to answer one more question and then?
I think so. And I was going to say, I wanted to give a reminder too, just for all of our students tomorrow. You're going to have 2 hours with our head distiller, Amy Levesque. And just remembering last year, this is a bonus for you. You are not being tested on everything Amy is going through. She's going to blow your minds. She's going to be talking for 2 hours about everything she does. This woman is brilliant. It's going to get very scientific and geeky. Sharpen your pencils, grab your notebooks. You'll need those if you want to try to keep up.
You will have a couple questions.
Yes, pay attention
on your quiz.
Don't hit mute and go watch TV. But yeah, it will be very thorough. What's the other question we've got, Professor?
Let's just randomly pick one here. Will there be another cask strength version coming anytime soon?
Well, Canadian Chris, I was going to say I can't speak for brand team or anyone, but I was at a tasting down at the distillery about a month and a half ago, going through some potential different barrel finishes of Lot 40. Don probably has about 20 different finishes happening with Lot 40. I think before the end of 2023, you're going to see one or two maybe pop up. But I can't say that for sure, but I would not be surprised. That's all I can say. If Dr. Don wants to say more, he's got the authority to say more. Well, so maybe we'll ask him that question again.
All right, I think we'll wrap up for today. If there are a few questions we didn't get to today, so don't worry. We will, for our students, make sure that we get those answered in the coming days, and we can pass it back to Liz.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for another great class, Gina and Dave. Like Gina said, we've got the questions that went unanswered here. So just like last week, we'll be sending those through to her. She'll send us the answers. Our students tomorrow, we'll see you at 3 p.m. on that Zoom with Amy. And then everyone else, we'll see you back here next week for class number 3 of Canadian Whiskey Certification. So thanks again to all of you. Thank you, Gina and Dave. And we will see you next Wednesday.
All right.
Bye,
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.